Well, good evening and welcome to another edition of CAF Warbird Tube. We are glad to have you with us tonight, and joining us, Scott Culver from New Jersey. Scott, glad to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about some B-24s, European theater, specifically your dad, who was a gunner on the B-24,
Yes.
30 missions, and we'll get into some of those details coming up. But I have to admit, this is the first guest we've had who has their own sizzle reel. So let's take a look. And with that, we have episode number 218. As I mentioned, Scott Culver, he's going to tell us the story of some B-24s from the 8th Air Force in England. He's an author and historian, and you can see from his uniform tonight that he takes this role very seriously and has done a lot of research. Now, whether this is your first time tuning in or you're one of our faithful Warbird Tube regulars, we're glad to have you with us tonight. And if you enjoy what you see, make sure you share that across your favorite social media platforms so we can keep history flying. Now, Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. If you'd like to learn more about our aircraft and where they're going to be this year out on tour, our other events, local units, or how you can be a part of the fun, just visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Now, as you're watching tonight and you're listening to what Scott has to say, it's going to be a very fascinating presentation. You might have some questions. Just drop those in the chat, and we'll try to answer them either during the presentation or before we wrap up. All right? So with that, Scott, welcome once again to the show, Son of a Gunner. That's
Thanks, Steve.
pretty catchy title.
Yes, it gets a lot of attention. Well, with my father having been a gunner on
Right.
B-24s, I thought that would be a cute little tagline to throw in there, and it gets people thinking about what it is I do.
That's right. And what you do is, obviously, you're an author, but you're also a history teacher.
Yes, that's correct. I spent over 20 years in a teaching field, and my specialty was American history and world history.
Great. And is that sort of where your dad's combat history and then your interest in history, is that kind of what drew you to write a book?
Yes, that's a great point, Steve. I was always hearing my father's wartime stories that really intrigued me about history in general. And then I thought about how does World War II fit into the big picture of history, and that just expanded my interest in the broader realms of other historical eras.
That's great. And I see you have the summer uniform on here.
Yes. This is a summer, what they call a khaki uniform. My father and his fellow airmen would have worn these during the hot summer days, both in the U.S. and anywhere overseas. And so this gave them a little more breathing material as opposed to the wool uniforms they wore during the colder months. And it looks sharp, too.
It certainly does.
Thank you.
So let's start out. 9 Yanks and a jerk, B-24
Yes.
Liberator.
So the title of the book came from the name of the plane. It's in the image behind me here. This was one of the B-24 Liberator heavy bombers that was assigned to my father's bomb group in 1943. Now, as some of our listeners know, every crew, for the most part, would like to nickname their airplane, and they usually would put something funny or comical on there that related to some personal story with the crew. So the original crew that named this plane was made up of 9 Northerners. That's men from the northern states in the United States, and 1 Southerner. So unfortunately, he got the butt end of the joke, but that was something private between the crew. I'm sure they shared it with their squadron members because everybody got a charge out of the name of the plane, and they still do today.
Yep.
So writing this book became something that grew out of a larger book that I'm writing called Daylight Raiders, which I've still been working on to this day. It's close to 14 years. And when I realized this plane had such a history of its own, not only with my father's crew and the original crew, but that Jimmy Stewart, their commanding officer, that is Jimmy Stewart, the movie actor, he was their squadron commander, of which this plane was part of my father's squadron. And so Stewart actually flew in his plane for 2 or 3 missions himself. And there are several other stories connected with this plane that are in the book, which relate to the plane's punishment that it could take after mission and being repaired and going back out and flying into enemy territory until its final mission on April 10th of 1944. And the pilot who flew that plane was the father of a famous news host from a cable network. I won't go into all that, but he was definitely well known, and he was able to guide the plane away from a village as it was on fire and descending to the earth after being shot down by German fighters. So the pilot escaped German capture after he bailed out, and he escapes into the Belgian underground, where he winds up getting repatriated months later. So this is one of several incredible stories about the crews and the men connected with this aircraft. So I actually had to go to Belgium to find out who the son was of that pilot. And then a local Belgian museum curator connected me with this cable host, this news cable host, and we wound up sharing stories further. And I told him I was writing this book, and he was thrilled to hear that I was including his father's story in it. So that's how this grew into its own book. It started out as a pamphlet to go with a poster, and it became its own freestanding book, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, this is your father and going into basic training, and good for you and for all of us that he actually talked about his wartime experiences, because so many airmen and all veterans, not all, but so many came back from the war and just didn't say anything about it until many years later. But I'm glad he shared those stories and inspired you.
Yes, I was fortunate to grow up hearing my father's stories. As many of our listeners know, not all World War II veterans or any combat veteran from any era is too quick to want to share some of those personal, dangerous, and traumatic experiences. But my father, when he saw my genuine interest as a young boy and a young man in his military service, he began to open up. And as I grew in age, the stories became more detailed. And I had such a fascination with how he survived the war through so many near-death experiences. I realized either he has to write a book or I have to write a book. One of the two of us was going to get this done. Because I said to myself, if he's not going to write it, the stories would die with me if I don't write it. And these really had to be put down in print. And eventually I hope to get a docudrama made out of this. I already have a couple of producers interested, so we'll keep you posted as to how that progresses as well. Yeah, so this book took on a life of its own. The majority of the book is about his mission flying as Jimmy Stewart's left wingman in this aircraft, 9 Yanks and a jerk. And, as you put up some of the slides, we could show the audience some of the pictures of how close these guys came to being shot down, and me not being here to tell this story as a result. So I'll leave it to you as to how you want to lead into that, Steve, or if you want to discuss something else first.
Sure. No. So this is your dad's crew. I'm assuming they're still stateside here.
Yes, both aircrew photos were taken stateside. The one with their bomber jackets on was taken at Sioux City, Iowa, before they deployed overseas. And Jimmy Stewart had been their squadron commander for just barely 3 months at that point. He was assigned to that squadron after a lot of petitioning to get into a combat assignment. So when they were in Sioux City, Iowa, they took these official Air Force photos, Army Air Force photos, as it was known then, because the Air Force was not a separate branch yet. They took these photos. They were officially taken for the Air Force records and to show the crews before they went overseas into harm's way. And this is something they would have multiple copies made of to give to every crew member, and eventually their families would get copies later on. But until they were home from overseas, you notice in the nose turret, there's a whiteout. And that's because the nose turret replaced a plain glass housing that looked like a greenhouse, multi-panel glass nose. But the turret that was recently installed before they got these planes was top secret. And they didn't want the German Air Force to know that we now had more firepower at the front of the plane, because the German fighter pilots wanted to attack head on, usually flying out of the sun so our pilots would be blinded and our gunners. And they didn't expect this kind of firepower coming their way. So when these planes went overseas, the Germans got a bit of a surprise when they saw these nose turrets installed. So that's why it was whited out in that photo. It was top secret at that point.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Jimmy Stewart, and he's probably the most famous Hollywood personality who went over in World War II. And there are a lot of them that did, but he was probably the highest profile because of his leadership role and flying B-24s. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, Stewart was training in B-17s. He was training pilots stateside. And he was really bucking for a combat assignment. He really wanted to go overseas. He didn't just want to remain stateside. And a lot of combat commanders did not want to take the responsibility of sending a high-profile movie star who had already won an Academy Award a couple years earlier to his death. So it was my father's bomb group commander, Colonel Robert Terrell, who got a phone call from Stewart's base in Idaho, and his commanding officer at that time was basically requesting for Stewart to go into combat. And Terrell said, well, if he wants to go, I'll take him on board. And that's how Jimmy Stewart became my father's squadron commander in September of 1943.
Yeah.
He was assigned in August, but my father met him the next month in September.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, I mean, he was a very famous actor by the time the war broke out.
Yes, he had already won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in the Philadelphia Story with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. And so all the guys knew who he was from that movie and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which was a couple years before that in 1939. So when my father meets him at their assignment in Sioux City, Iowa, this was their final phase of combat crew training. And that meant they were ready to go overseas once that training was done. So from September through October of 1943, Stewart was flying in the planes with these guys, and they were practicing combat formations, tight, close flying, high altitude, nighttime flying, all those kinds of experiences before they went overseas. And they did not know they were going to Europe. That was not known until they got the orders from a base in Florida when they took off from there. And then they all realized they were heading to Europe, which they knew was a very risky place to be flying combat in. But Stewart did not shrink from his responsibilities. He flew some of the most dangerous missions of the war right with those guys, and he flew in the lead plane on all those missions, which was a deadly place to be because you were in some of the first frontal assaults going into the target.
This movie poster the movie poster that we have up now, The Mortal Storm, this is kind of a B movie, but one that we had talked about earlier, but I'm going to have to look this up. It's got a pretty interesting story.
Yes, I had seen this movie a few times over the years before I wrote the book. And then I looked at it again online when I was getting ready to write the book, because I knew Stewart had already done this movie to sort of throw back in the face of Germany what they were doing was wrong. And Hollywood was really behind making those types of movies, that the threat in Europe was real. It had to be taken seriously. So he plays a character who does not buy into the Nazi political party and their agenda, but he's living in Germany at the time, and he winds up trying to help a family escape into a neutral country. And the movie's about that, how they're trying to evade Nazi capture, and the Nazis know he's taking people out of the country against their wills, past the checkpoints. And to make a long story short, the movie actually got played in Germany in 1939 when it came out. And the head of the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, saw the film and was so offended by its anti-Nazi inference. They never mention the word Nazi in the movie, but the inference is so heavy that Göring ordered that the movie be banned from the German cinema at that time. And then when they found out a few years later that Stewart was flying combat missions over France and Germany, Göring personally stated in so many words that if they ever shoot down Stewart, they were going to make a personal example out of him. But thank God he was never shot down.
Yeah.
True story. Truth is stranger than fiction, right?
Sometimes.
Yes.
And of course, one of the films that he's probably best known for is It's a Wonderful Life. This is post-war, however.
Yes. Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we were talking earlier as well, and both of us had different citations on this, that if you watch the film, especially the bar scene where he kind of breaks down, it's really his emotional reaction to what he had experienced in the war that he drew on to really get that very powerful scene on film.
Yes, that's exactly correct. I had read a few articles and looked this one up in particular, because when I refer people to Jimmy Stewart, I refer them to that film because it comes on during the holidays. And often that scene comes up in discussions with people who know about his wartime service. And so I discovered from my readings and research that what you said is absolutely true. He was taking into that scene his emotional turmoil from sending his combat crews, some of them, to their deaths on the bombing missions. And it's something he never really got over. It's something he carried with him the rest of his life. And that's why he would often not talk about his wartime experiences, because that, I think, is probably what hit him the hardest in terms of his wartime service and carrying that weight with him. But it gets fleshed out in the film where he breaks down at the bar, and that's exactly what he had on his mind when he was acting out that scene. It's
amazing.
Yes.
Well, as you mentioned, he actually started out in B-17s.
Yeah, so Stewart had already earned his private pilot's license before the war. His acting had afforded him the ability to take private lessons. So in the 1930s, and even as a kid, he already had a fascination with airplanes. So when he became an actor, he could afford the pilot's lessons. So when you went through the military service, they looked for what you had a bent towards, what was your interest in life, and they wanted to capitalize on that. So even though he enlisted as an enlisted man, he went in as a buck private, he soon was promoted to an officer once they found out he had a private pilot's license. He passed the officer's test. He already had a college degree from Princeton University in architecture, and so that afforded him the rank of a first lieutenant. So he was promoted to an officer's rank, and then he went into pilot training from there with the Army Air Forces, and he eventually graduated to the B-17, which is a 4-engine heavy bomber. So he was assigned to Gowan Field out in Boise, Idaho, and that's where he was training young men to become B-17 bomber pilots. But having had months and months of those experiences of training, he saw other men who he had trained getting combat assignments, and he couldn't understand why he, who was already a well-experienced pilot could not get a combat assignment himself. So he kept petitioning his commanding officer to help him get assigned to a combat group. So, like I said before, nobody really wanted to take on the responsibility of sending a high-profile movie actor to his death in combat. But Colonel Terrell understood Stewart's patriotism and his sincere desire to go, and he knew he was an accomplished pilot from all the hours he had logged in B-17s. So it wasn't much of a transition for Stewart to go from the 4-engine B-17 to the 4-engine B-24. He checked out in the B-24 in virtually no time, so he got assigned to Terrell's bomb group. They were known by the nickname Terrell's Terrors. They were very skilled pilots, and my father's pilot, Colonel, he retired as a colonel, but then he was Captain Williams, William B. Williams. They all called him Mac. My father's pilot and Stewart became very good friends, and my father's pilot was such an excellent pilot. Stewart wanted him as his wingman on any mission they flew together, because in case the lead man, which Stewart was, got shot down, the guy usually flying to his right was deputy lead. And so he would take over the lead position. And obviously Stewart chose my father's pilot either to be on the right or his left wing in case of an emergency. And on this particular mission in the plane 9 Yanks and a Jerk, Stewart's plane did take some damage from anti-aircraft fire. But thankfully, he was able to complete the mission. He was not shot down. But my father's crew was on his left wing that day. And Stewart's radio had gotten shot out, so they really couldn't communicate with the rest of the group. So the deputy lead and my father's crew, these guys were staying close to him and taking hand signals and other signals from his command at that point. Yeah, so he flew in the most dangerous position, which is the lead plane going into the target. So what you see here is the ball turret, which is a rotating sphere that has 250 caliber machine guns, twins, that fire at German fighter planes in the hope of shooting as many down as they can to keep them from flying further combat missions or repeating another flyby on the same mission. So the planes would dive in from the 12 o'clock high position. So what that would be, if you're standing on top of the plane or you're sitting in the pilot's seat and you're facing forward, the forward position is the 12 o'clock position on a clock face. So if you lay the clock face flat on the plane and 12 o'clock is straight ahead, the Germans usually flew out of that position because that was often where the sun was, and the gunners as well as the pilots could not see the fighter planes so easily. So when they dove in through the formations, they'd be strafing our planes, hoping to hit the wings, to hit the gas tanks, to send the planes down in flames. But any planes that were able to shoot at them as they were coming down, my father would catch them as they were going underneath. So in the ball turret, he could catch them as they were descending under them. And my father told me he'd have to shoot ahead of their planes, hoping they'd fly into the bullets. It was a tough position to be in because you had to use foot pedals to swing that turret around while you're looking through a gun sight and using what they called was an early computer then. It was more of an analog computer. But my father had to account for wind drift, airspeed. Had to make a few calculations while he was in there, but mostly it was shooting ahead of the plane while looking through the gun sight. And as you can see from that image, that's a cramped space to be doing that in. Even if you're 20 years old, it's still a tight spot to be in.
Oh, yeah. And you mentioned before, your dad was 6 foot tall.
Yes, which is an unusual height to put inside that tiny sphere. Most guys were 5'6" and under. They put the shorter guys in there. But I think for two reasons. Number one, my father was the youngest member on the plane, 20 years old, and he was thin as a rail, like a string bean. So I think that's how he got the luck of the draw. But thank God he was only in there for about 10 of his 30 missions. The rest of them were flown in the left waist gun.
Yeah.
Yeah, eventually they felt the ball turret was a bit of a drag on the airspeed, and they didn't feel it was worth the weight and the drag on a plane. So later in the war, after my father finished his missions, even while he was still finishing his missions, it wasn't used as much as it had been. And eventually they just removed it.
Yeah.
So that's me at the left waist gun where my father would have fired from. So, of course, I'm not wearing the heavy bomber fleece outfit. I'm wearing the summer flying uniform. So that's what he would have looked like in gunnery school in Fort Myers, Florida, as he was trained to be an aerial gunner in smaller planes down in the base in Florida. So this was the Collings Foundation B-24 Witchcraft. So there I am on a hot summer day, bearing up with it for a video demonstration what my father and his crew would have looked like in combat at high altitude. Now, you have to keep in mind, even though it's a hot summer day where I'm standing there, even in warm weather in England, it could get pretty hot. And they'd have to be in this full gear before they got into the plane, because they would be at high altitude within a few minutes once they got into the air and got into formation. And because these planes were not pressurized like our modern aircraft or even our combat aircraft today, they were open window planes, so they were unpressurized. So when they got up to a mile or 2 miles high, they're feeling 30 to 60 below zero weather. That's like being in the South Pole. So they had to dress like they were going to the North or the South Pole. And even early in the war, guys were getting frostbite with all this heavy gear on. So what they eventually had to do was create electric flying suits to go underneath what I'm wearing in that photo. So by the time they were geared up, they've got their parachute on, they throw a flak vest on over this that weighed about 40 or 50 pounds itself, maybe 30 or 40 pounds. By the time they were all geared up, they were wearing, I would say, 60 to 70 pounds of gear. And so my father's last surviving combat buddy, who was the top turret gunner, this is what he said to me about wearing all that gear. He says, this is why they send 20-year-olds into combat. Because wearing all that, the average guy at midlife would have a hard time with that. Even at 20 years old or 22 years old, that's still a lot to wear. So when my father and his buddies came back from these missions, they were totally drained and exhausted from wearing this gear, being in combat, being on pure oxygen at high altitude. That does knock you out. Like you say, when you go out and get fresh air on a cold day, you feel exhausted after that sometimes. So when he came back from some of these missions, all he could do was drag his gear back to his barracks and fall asleep on the cot. He even wound up missing some of the debriefing missions, which they were required to attend, but he just couldn't even stand up at that point. That's how bad it was after some of his missions. So there I am again in the summer flight uniform. That's a lot easier to get around in when I do most of these talks around the aircraft, when I go to the air shows and do some reenacting. That, by the way, is a real 1943 flight vest, really life vest. So I wanted to get as much accuracy and authentic pieces I could. Some of it's reproduction, but it's a pleasure to be able to do this. It gets a lot of interest, especially at the air shows. So this is a painting I had made up of this particular mission, February 25th, 1944. This is a moment of impact when my father's plane with a squadron were flying over what we commonly know as the city of Nuremberg, Germany. They were actually bombing an airfield just outside of Nuremberg in a suburb called Fürth, F-U-R-T-H. They were bombing not only an airfield, but a German aircraft production factory, which is making components for German fighter planes and other planes. So at the moment of impact, they had just dropped the bombs and were banking in a turn to head back to their base in England. And at this time, the Germans were shooting aircraft shells up at them, 88 millimeter anti-aircraft shells, which either explode on impact or some of them are set for detonation at a certain altitude. Well, my father's top turret gunner always swore that the one they got hit with was a dud, which I agree. He said it was made by slave labor because the Germans put a lot of their captive slaves into the manufacturing plants to make ammunition. And so when this shell ripped through the plane, it went through the bomb bay doors, which had just closed after bombs away. It tore through the bomb bay catwalk, blew through the flight deck, actually the lower flight deck where the radio operator was. It missed him by 2 feet. It missed hitting the top turret gunner who was in his gun position by a couple of feet. And it hit the pilot's armor plating, which is about a ½ inch thick. And thank God he had that armor plating right behind the pilot's seat. It was there for a reason, to protect the pilot. So when it hit the armor plating, it did not explode. It ricocheted out the side of the plane. And right where you see the words nine Yanks and a jerk, you see the hole about the size of a window. And it was big enough to stick a man's head through. Well, that sucked out that hole, a pair of boots, combat boots. Yeah, that's the size of the shell. So imagine that thing blowing through a plane, ricocheting off armor plating and ripping out a hole. And the suction brought a pair of combat boots and a packed parachute right out the hole, sucked it right out with the escaping debris. That stuff blew over the wing. You could see it going over the wing there. And my father was at the left waist gun window firing at any enemy planes in the distance. Well, that debris hit his .50 caliber machine gun and literally ripped it out of his hands and knocked him off balance. He didn't know what it was. It all happened so instantaneously. So in addition to that shell shock my father got and the crew got, the top turret gunner now had to assess what was the damage, because when it went through the bomb bay catwalk and ripped through the flight deck, it also splintered some hydraulic lines. So they were losing hydraulic fluid and it was bleeding out over the deck. And he had to make sure the gas lines weren't punctured either, because then it could be losing fuel and the vapors could wind up setting the plane on fire should there be another round of machine gun fire shot at them. So the top turret gunner got out of his turret. He made an assessment of the plane and said to the pilot, I think we have enough hydraulic fluid that when we get back to the base in England, we could do a landing, but you're going to have to touch your brakes gently. So I interviewed this man. His name was George Snook. He was a tech sergeant. I must have interviewed him over 50 times on the phone and in person before he died a few years ago at age 98. And he told me like it was yesterday in his 90s what happened. He said, being a flight engineer, you only need 2 tools at that time, a pair of pliers and a screwdriver. He said, if you can't fix anything with that, you can't repair it. So he crawls up to where the hydraulic line was severed. He saw it on the side of the plane where some of the flying debris had cut it. And he pinched off the line to keep the rest of the hydraulic fluid from leaking out. But they knew they didn't have enough to bring the main landing gear down. So they got the plane turned around right after this incident, and they've got to fly 3.5 hours back to their base in England. And in the meantime, they've got to ward off German fighters. So everybody's still got to be in their combat position, especially the gunners, to ward off the fighters. Well, once they got over the English Channel, they were in relative safety at that point. So now they start concentrating on what are we going to do when we get back to our air base. So George, the flight engineer, told me, he said he told the guys in the back of the plane, like my father and some of the other gunners, to look at how he would hand crank the main landing gear down once they got over the base in England, which was at Tibbenham, which is about almost 15 miles south of Norwich, England. It's over in the eastern part of England. So they get over the air base and they're circling. He says, I want you to watch me hand crank the gear down to make sure it gets locked. When it gets locked, a yellow bar appears to show that it was all locked in place. And then once they got that done through hand signals, because part of their communication system was shot out as well, they had to use hand signals. He and my father had to crawl into the nose of the plane and try and get the nose wheel down, which did not hand crank down like the main gear. They had to shove it out in place to get it to lock in place. Well, they both had a hard time, especially George, because he was the closest one to it. And they were running out of fuel. They had to land. So they shot a red flare for a preferential emergency landing. Stewart had done the same thing because his plane was hit. He landed first. And he goes and parks his plane, and he's waiting for my father's crew to come in because he knows they're pretty shot up. He didn't know the extent of the damage, but he could see they shot the red flare. So the pilot says to George, he says, let's just go with what we got. I'll use heavy flaps. We'll get all the weight in the back of the plane. So George orders every man except the pilot, the co-pilot, and himself to go to the rear end of the plane. So my father and all these guys crawl into the small base back into the tail to weigh the tail down because they want to take the weight off the nose because they don't know how this nose wheel is going to hold. So they approached the base. They used the full length of the runway. Mac put the plane down right at the edge of the runway. He's dragging the tail with full flaps, so there's sparks flying all the way down the runway. The guys in the back are holding on for dear life. And George was calling out airspeed and altitude to the pilot and the co-pilot because both these guys had to use the flaps and both their strength to get this bird the way it needed to be in the landing. So as they get toward the end of the runway, Mac puts the nose down gently. And as they were just about to turn to go to their hard stand parking area, the nose wheel collapsed. And it looked like this plane here. The nose skidded. They actually went off the runway and into a field. This is not the plane. This is another plane. But this is to illustrate how the plane wound up. So the tail seesaws into the air, and all the guys in the back of the plane hit the ceiling, including my father. So they're getting banged up and bruised like being in a tin can. So the tail end is sticking up in the air. The nose is buried in the English mud at the end of the runway, which already was wet from the winter mud. Well, Stewart was the first guy to come running over to see these guys to see if they were all okay, because that plane could have exploded had they seesawed the wrong way or the wings had tipped or tilted one way or another. So the guys in the front of the plane start crawling toward the bomb bay, and they start getting out of a hatch there. My father and his other buddies had already come out of the tail. My father was so shaken up, he started lighting a cigarette away from the plane because he certainly didn't want to ignite any fuel or fumes. So at 20 years old, he's shaking like a leaf trying to get a cigarette into his mouth. And right at that moment, Jimmy Stewart comes over to him. And my father's the first guy he sees from the crew. And Stewart says to my father, "Sergeant, is everyone okay?" My father says, while he's shaking with the cigarette at his mouth, he says, "Yes, sir, we're all okay, just a little bruised and banged up." He says, "Well, where's Mac, the pilot?" My father says, "He's in the front of the ship looking at the hole, sir." So my father walks Stewart to the front of the plane, put out the cigarette, and they all go and they look at the gaping hole in this plane. And Stewart looked at the hole, and he looked at Mac, who was his drinking buddy. He said, "Mac, when I saw that hole, I thought you were a goner. I thought they got you." He gave Mac a hug. Mac and Stewart were supposed to go to a BBC broadcast in London that night and do a radio interview. Well, they never made it to London that night. They and the rest of the officers from that flight went to the officers club and got so bombed, they literally had to sleep it off in the hospital beds that night. It's a true story. And that's how that mission ended. So the guy you see sticking his head out of the hole is the ground crew chief. and the ground crew chief was responsible for the repairs of the aircraft. So that's Grant Murray. He stayed in England for the duration of the war, and he and others got this plane repaired, and it actually went into combat for a few more missions after that. Can you believe that?
Yeah, that was it's absolutely amazing to put it back together, and yeah. Eventually, though, the airplane does get shot down. Not with your father on board.
Right. It was a different crew flying the plane on another mission. So my father's mission was February 25th of 44. That was the big week missions. It's where they had clear airspace over Germany, and we bombed as many targets that week as we could. And then in April of 44, a couple of months later, this plane is flown by a man by the name of Samuel Schleichhorn, but he changed his name after the war to Sean. So when I did my original research, I never connected the name change to the original aircrew list I was looking at the World War II flight folders inside of. So long story short, on the April 10th mission, my father was flying in another plane as this man's wingman. So 9 Yanks and a Jerk was flown by Samuel Schleichhorn, who became Samuel Sean. Well, that plane gets attacked with the rest of the squadron by German fighter planes. Well, they were going to bomb a target in Zwickau, Germany. It was an aircraft manufacturing plant. And the mission got recalled due to bad weather over the target. So as they were just heading over the Belgian border into German airspace, they got turned around from the mission recall signal. As they're flying back over Belgium, they get jumped by enemy fighters above them and below them. So the German fighters are not only shooting machine gun bullets, they're shooting 20 millimeter cannon rounds. And so some of these rounds are very incendiary. So when they hit the plane, they set the plane on fire. So they shot at the plane from underneath and from above, and the plane caught fire. Now, this is why this book became a book of its own, because this story is just as incredible, if not more so, than my father's story. So as Samuel Sean is the pilot guiding the plane, he knows the plane is on fire. He orders the crew to bail out. Now, my father is watching this from his left waist gun window in another plane. These guys are basically flying wingtip to wingtip for maximum firepower against German fighter planes that are attacking them. Well, another German fighter sweeps in. He shoots the tail turret off the plane with the gunner still trapped inside the turret. And the guy was so shocked at the moment he was severed from the turret. But even though he was shocked, he had enough cognition to look at my father in the left waist gun, who was just a stone's throw away. He waves goodbye to my father as he's going down in the turret, trapped, falling to his death. My father, all he could do is look out the left waist gun window and give him a quick wave goodbye, and his friend was gone. His name was Martin Clayball. Well, Martin Clayball fell to his death, and the body has never been recovered to this day. And a few years ago during the pandemic, a couple of researchers from the Pentagon read my book with the hopes of locating Martin Clayball's remains. Now, I didn't do enough research over there, even though I've been to Belgium twice. I didn't have the time to go literally knocking door to door in the general area where the impact occurred. But I had always hoped that if I could get a TV production made of this, we would send a crew over with some leads that I do have, and literally go and ask some of the locals, because the locals, even if they're not the original eyewitnesses who were there, they always told their families the stories. So somebody, I'm sure, knows where the body was eventually interred, because the Belgians tried to keep the Germans from getting any of our military intel, including a turret that could have provided information as to how the guns were, what the gun sites were like, or any information off the dead airman's body that could give them any clue as to combat operations or anything along those lines. So I still suspect to this day there's probably a local Belgian family that buried the body so the German patrols could not get him. They may have gotten a turret, but I still would love to see that be the conclusion to this book and this whole story, because that family has contacted me, the descendants of Martin Claiborne, and they've wanted to see did I have any leads as to where the airman's remains could possibly be. So that's the unfinished part of this story, hopefully yet to be completed.
Well, there you go. And one of our viewers, Henry, asked if you've been in contact with anyone in Hollywood or the film or documentary arena to try to put this story on film.
Yes, I've actually written to a couple of movie actors who are also producers. I had one slight interest, but there wasn't a follow-up. Mm-hmm. So I pursued my contact at the Cable News Network, which is a nationally known network. The man whose father flew alongside my father, who flew the plane on its final mission, he would like to see it made into a docudrama. He was going to ask some other producers to help that get into production. But with the recent outbreak of the war in Israel and all the new political stories, their podcast networks, which we were hoping to air it on, got so inundated with those stories that we were not able to get this thing in motion yet. So I also have an external producer who has produced for several major cable channels related to history and these kinds of stories. He would like to get it made as well, but we need sponsors and backers for that. So it's a matter of money, logistics, who's available. So yes to his question. I have reached out to people, not as much to Hollywood, but to the network I already have connections with. So if he knows anybody, tell him, let me know. We'll look into it.
Any leads are appreciated.
Absolutely.
Well, this is a great study in contrast.
Yes.
With and I think reflective of many veterans of not only World War II but any conflict. Your father going into basic training November of 42, and then the look on his face. 18 months later in July of 1944, you like you said earlier, is a teenager in the left picture and a young man, a seasoned veteran in the right.
Yes. His older sister always told me he went into the service as a young boy, so to speak, and came out a man. And you can see what the experience of combat did to my father's countenance as you look at the two photos. In fact, the one on the right in 1944, that was taken right after he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. So he had just finished his 30 combat mission tour of duty. And even when he came home a few months later on the cruise ship, the Queen Mary, which they had turned into a troop ship, when he got off the ship and came home, his sister and his mother were there, and when they saw him, they saw how exhausted he looked. And that was even a couple months after he had finished his tour of duty. So they knew it had been a traumatic experience for him. And sadly, my father had nightmares for about 7 years after that. So he definitely had PTSD, wasn't as well diagnosed then as it is today. So yeah, he definitely suffered, as well as Stewart and many of the other guys. And they were just basically told to suck it up and go back to civilian life and get on with your life. And some guys could do it, some didn't. Unfortunately, not all could. So there he is, receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross. That's Colonel Schwartz awarding that to him. I actually went down to Florida and interviewed Colonel Schwartz's daughter and his grandson about 11 years ago, 12 years ago. They were thrilled that I was writing this book and including their father's story, because Colonel Schwartz flew many combat missions with Jimmy Stewart as well. And Colonel Schwartz knew the dangers of war firsthand, having flown on some of the most dangerous missions as well. So this is the first photo I really remember my father showing me as a young boy. And he had just built a brand new bar in the basement. and he had this displayed prominently on the top of the bar. And I said, I was 5 years old, and I said, "Is that you?" He said, "Yes, that was me when I was a very young man." So this was 1970. I was 5 years old. And of course, he was about 47 at that time. So he pulls a photo close to me, and he starts explaining this story to me about how he got decorated with the Distinguished Flying Cross for finishing his 30 combat missions at the height of the air war, when it was one of the most dangerous times to fly combat. And so as I sat there as a 5-year-old, I was completely mesmerized and so taken by this iconic shot. From that point forward, I looked at my father as a hero. And I knew a few years later, at age 8, I would be going into the Air Force myself. That's the God's honest truth. After seeing this photo and the other ones he began to show me, and the stories like I just shared with you, I knew I had to do my time in the service and serve my country as well. So it was his wartime service and experiences, and especially this photo, that planted that seed of service and sacrifice.
It's an amazing story, and I'm glad, again, I'm glad that he felt comfortable enough to share that with you.
Yes.
Like I said, it's inspired this entire sort of track that your life has been on.
Yes.
How long did it take for you to do the research of the book? I know just a minute ago you mentioned something about 11 years ago you did some interviews,
yes.
But how long did it take?
Yes. Well, this book I began writing while I was still teaching full time. So for 5 years of teaching, I immersed myself into the writing, traveling, and research, including 7 trips to the National Archives and 4 trips to Europe, and probably close to 20 trips across the U.S. over a 5-year period while I was teaching. Mm-hmm. And then, I really started at his death in 2011. The book got published in 2015. But I did a couple of updates to the book as I interviewed his last surviving combat buddy even more, and then did the cable news interview and learned from that host a little more. So the most recent edition is 2020. So yes, it was a good 10 or 11 year period of research and travel. And the story just grew and grew because as I interviewed family members and my father's last surviving combat buddy, the book became what it is now. And everyone who's read it has loved it and are absolutely intrigued by all the stories related to this aircraft. So the plane really is well known within the families of that squadron.
When you first started on your research, how did you decide where to go first? I mean, did someone give you some pointers, or you just kind of dug out the investigation yourself?
Well, it's a couple things. That's a great question, by the way, Steve. Being a history teacher at the time, I already understood the idea of primary source documents, which meant I had to go to the original records. And I knew the National Archives from some computer research that I learned. The National Archives are the custodians of their bomb group and every bomb group's records that were based in England. I mean, they literally have the folders and the files and the papers these guys carried with them around the office, on the plane. I even saw my father's signature on several papers there at the archives in College Park, Maryland. So it was that I knew I had to do, and I knew I had to get to the surviving eyewitnesses as fast as I could. So as soon as my father passed away, not a day or two later, I wrote to his combat buddy in Springfield, Ohio, George Snook, who was the top turret gunner. I knew he was the last one alive. And he wrote to me right away. He said, call me right away. So within a couple of days, I had a letter. We were on the phone. He says, I'm so sorry to hear about your dad. He says, but I'm so thrilled that you're so interested in our stories. I said, well, I'm not only interested, George, I want to write the book that I begged my father to write for 30 years. He said, really? I said, yes, I would like to come out and meet you face to face and begin interviewing you so that I could piece this story together. Well, he was thrilled that I was that interested. So I drove out to Ohio, a good 10 hours from New Jersey. He and his wife put me up at their home for a weekend, and did we have the time of our lives. He was so thrilled not only to sit and answer questions, he took me to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, and gave me a personal tour of the whole museum. And he was 90 years old at the time. He had just turned 90. And then he took me to another air museum in Urbana, the Champaign Aviation Museum. He had been volunteering there for years. Well, he took me on a personal tour of that museum. I wound up making a lot of friends there, and I wound up making 10 trips out to Ohio to spend time with him, and well over 50 phone calls over that. Let's see, he died in 2019, so for about an eight and a half year period, he and I became best of friends, and his wife said it gave him a whole new lease on life. It really was great for both of us. Yes. I could see why he was one of my father's best friends during the war. They were combat buddies.
That's good. Stefan was asking a question about Jimmy Stewart being a pilot before he entered service. Do you happen to know how many hours of flight time he had when he entered the service?
You know, I couldn't say off the top of my head exactly, but for some reason, 300 plus hours pops into my head. I'd have to verify that, but I remember reading somewhere that he had quite a bit of time because to my recollection, he had been flying from maybe 1936, 1937, somewhere in that time frame, mid to late 1930s. So he had already been logging in quite a few hours by the time he enlisted in early 1941. I'm quite sure it was at least a couple hundred hours. But again, I'd have to verify that through a few sources. But that's an excellent question.
Yeah, good. If someone was interested in your book, how can they get a copy?
Well, they have a couple ways. They could go to my website, sonofagunner B24.com. On my front page are links to a couple of different book selling sites. And I also have a special page dedicated to Nine Yanks and a Jerk on my website. And they could go through that, get a further summary and details of the book there and other hot links to the book purchasing sites.
Awesome. Sean said, just out of curiosity, One Yank and You're Off is the name of a book about Irish warbirds. Have you heard of that one before?
I cannot say that I have. I heard another similar one, but not that one in particular.
No. Okay. That's great. So, where can folks find you on social media? I know you're on LinkedIn.
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn. I also have a YouTube channel, both of which you can find on the top of my website. I'm restructuring my venture into Facebook and other social media platforms. So I'm looking at what some of my better options for those are. I had been on Facebook, but I might go back there or look at some other interfaces. But the best way to contact me right now is my website. There's a portal for that. And they can also check out my YouTube channel and my LinkedIn page.
Sounds good. Any final thoughts before we wrap up tonight?
I just want to thank you, Steve and Blaine and Leah, for making the time for us to do this interview. It is an absolute thrill to honor my father and his generation by relating these stories, inspiring future generations to appreciate what these men and women did in serving, and in some cases, in many cases, sacrificing their lives for our freedoms. As my father always said, freedom is not free. And that's how I'd like to end that segment.
Sounds good. Scott, thank you again for being with us tonight. And thank you, all of you who stuck around and watched the show. A very fascinating show. Scott, again, thank you for being a part of that. And if you have any thoughts about tonight's show or any topics you'd like to see us explore in the future, just drop us a note at media@cafhq.org. And again, please share this across your social media. And if you are subscribing on YouTube, make sure you click the bell icon. You'll get notifications when our new episodes are posted. Until next time, I'm Steve Buss. Have a great night.